Welcome to Question Time. Is Ukraine's President Zelensky asking for too much when he asked the UK to send fighter jets to Ukraine? And should the death penalty, supported by a senior Conservative politician, be up for debate? Tonight, Question Time is in the historic town of Swindon in Wiltshire. Once the epicentre of the railway industry, this place has a Conservative MP. The Borough Council is under Conservative control, but the town has a Labour mayor. And with us, we have over 100 people chosen to reflect the electoral support for the political parties of England. Welcome to Question Time. On our panel tonight, Minister in the shiny new Department of Science, Technology and Innovation is George Freeman. 2 days in the job, that is. He's creator also of the Big Tent Festival, which encourages young people to engage with politics. Labour's Shadow Secretary for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities is Lisa Nandy. She's in her 14th year as MP for Wigan and has long been talked of as leader material. She came third in the Labour leadership contest of 2020. Sarah Olney is one of the 14 Liberal Democrat MPs at Westminster. She speaks for the party on the Treasury and on business. The former bookseller and accountant is now MP for the rather beautiful London constituency of Richmond Park. Inaya Folarin Iman is a former Brexit Party candidate. She's also founder of the Equiano Project, a debate and ideas forum promoting freedom of speech. Until May, she hosted a culture and politics discussion programme on GB News and is a trustee for the National Portrait Gallery, all at the age of just 26. Matthew Syed is an author of 6 books, a Sunday Times columnist, broadcaster and speaker. One of his books, Black Box Thinking, argues the key to success is a positive attitude to failure. In a past life, he was England's finest table tennis player for a decade, went twice to the Olympics. Good evening from Swindon. Welcome to our panel. Welcome to our audience. Great to see you. And, of course, welcome to you at home. Do join the debate. It's always pretty lively, to say the least, on social media. Do feel free to add your point of view. It's at BBC Question Time. Let's hear what you've got to say. Right, we'll start off with our first question tonight, which is from Paul Buckle.
With nothing off the table, including sending UK's 100-plus Typhoon jets to the Ukraine, is the UK provoking a Russian escalation?
So, of course, we've had President Zelensky here in Britain yesterday and in Europe today asking for jets, unequivocally asking for jets to help him defeat Russia. Lisa, is that risking provoking a Russian escalation?
Well, I'm going to do something quite unusual on this panel and not escalate the row between me and George, because I think, actually, the government deserves some credit for the way that they've approached this. There is clearly a risk of escalation, and throughout this war in Ukraine, it's been a very difficult balancing act to ensure that we don't end up escalating the situation, particularly given the role that NATO potentially plays. And I think that the government is right to handle this with care, whilst being absolutely crystal clear across all the political parties represented on this panel that we stand with Ukraine and we will continue to move heaven and earth to make sure that they have what they need in order to win this war. Every country has to play their part in providing assistance. The Prime Minister said yesterday that we would train the pilots that were needed for those jets. That is something that Britain can offer, we can constructively do, and I think he was right to offer it. If I could just, in the spirit of being constructive, just push the government to do one more thing, though, it's that I think we need a longer-term strategy and we need to lay that out about how we're going to support Ukraine. I think it would convince our allies to do more. I think it would send a very clear message to the brave men and women that are currently fighting on the front line in Ukraine.
What do you mean
that we stand with them?
Long-term strategy?
So we need a strategy to seize Russian state assets here in the UK and use the proceeds in order to fund the reconstruction of Ukraine. We need to make it clear that we've got a proper plan to support Ukraine, not just between now and the end of this war, but afterwards as well, to rebuild the country. We need to tell President Putin that we will stand with the people of Ukraine, not just until they've won the war, but until they've won the peace.
Okay. George. So, Volodymyr Zelensky was very clear he was very grateful for the assistance to pilots. Trying to ascertain what that means. I mean, he said, you know, thank you for your English tea and I'll thank you in advance for your English powerful jets. He wants more than training. He wants the jets. He says without the jets, he can't defeat Russia. And the government wants him to defeat Russia.
Yeah, look, it was a brilliant speech, truly spine-tingling. And to stand united, peers, MPs from all parties, the ovations went on and on, because I think we're united in wanting to send a very clear message to the Kremlin. You will not win. You must not win. We cannot, as the West, whatever our differences between nations and geopolitical tensions, the big one is we cannot send a signal that bullies like Putin and criminal kleptocracies like the Kremlin can walk into neighbouring countries, abandon and neglect all the human rights that we have died for in previous wars. We cannot allow it. And
but this is exactly what Zelensky was saying. And he was saying, to that end, give me some jets. And you had Boris Johnson, for example, saying the best use of Typhoon jets is to deploy them now for the protection of the Ukrainians. Yeah, do you disagree?
No, we absolutely agree. And that's why, I mean, 3 points to the question. The Prime Minister yesterday went with President Zelensky to see the tank training crews and the pilots we're starting to train. So we are on the front foot. And to your point about international leadership, actually the UK here has led internationally. We've convened and other countries have come with us. We were way out in front. And some credit to Boris Johnson on that, actually, and other countries have followed. And what we're signalling here is you must come with us again. None of us can afford to let Putin win. So the Prime Minister is very clear yesterday, very supportive of Ukraine, and we are actually leading in establishing that international coalition.
Can I just put... There is clearly a political consensus that it is right to stand up to Putin. But where was that political consensus when Putin invaded Crimea? Where was that political consensus when he was bombing Grozny, when he was backing the murderous regime in Syria? You might remember that Putin was incentivized to continue to loot money from the Russian people because he knew it could be recycled. In Mayfair, in Knightsbridge, we rolled out the red carpet to Roman Abramovich. I think that it is a complete whitewashing of history for our political class to say we're standing up to Putin. The first sanction against Russian oligarchs happened when Russian tanks were massing on the border. There were no weapons sent to Ukraine, even though a backbench Conservative MP said in 2016 we're repealing the mistake of Chamberlain in Czechoslovakia in 1938. We need to learn the lessons here. And I think airbrushing history in the way that I fear the political class is doing means we will not learn the lessons when it comes to China and Taiwan.
OK, let's hear from our audience. Yes. Coming here.
So, the UK is planning to train Ukrainian pilots. How is the government planning to do that when we're struggling to train our own pilots?
OK, I'll come back to you on that, because that's something a number of people have been saying in the papers today, I think you're referring to. Yes, man there in the white shirt.
How much is it going to cost the UK government to actually support the Ukrainians in their battle against Putin? Because we have an NHS crisis, we have railway workers going on strike. When we need to invest money on our own infrastructure and our own country, how can we afford then to further exponentiate that finance cost to another country?
Would you rather that we stopped or we did less?
I'd say less. Think logically about the support that we can give whilst we support other countries, such as Germany, that are sending over fighter jets, but also take into account that we have our own problems here in the UK that needs to be addressed much quicker and much more vigorously than what's going on in the Ukraine at the moment.
Okay. And the woman in the orange top there.
The hypocrisy is astounding for the politicians. When you talk about supporting Ukrainians, they're the ones dying there. Yep. We're just sitting here having a battle with Putin. Where was this long-term plan when in Afghanistan happened, when Iraq happened? What happened to those people when they died? You didn't rebuild anything there. And look what their state is. So to sit here and say we should do something, there have been strikes going on. We're not supporting, we're not helping anyone within UK, but we will stand against Putin. Is that what our priority should be?
Okay, yeah. Sarah.
Well, I was in Westminster Hall yesterday and I was listening to President Zelensky and I found it incredibly inspiring. I think he's genuinely one of the people who can really be said to have made history. He's certainly, I think, changed the course of what was happening in Ukraine from what I think this time last year many people thought might be inevitable. So I found it incredibly inspiring. I think, and, you know, he couldn't have been clearer. He would like jets. He wants us to send jets. And, you know, he's a great, great speaker.
But Paul's question is, should we send jets to Ukraine, or even talking about it? Obviously, Rishi Sunak said nothing's off the table. Yeah. Does that risk provoking an escalation?
I think the most important thing is that we need to work with our international allies. We can't do this alone anyway. We need to work in tandem with our NATO allies. It's so important that we are
presenting... Does it risk... I mean, because you're all saying that.
Yeah.
But the question is, does it risk provoking an escalation?
I mean, I think one of the reasons we've been reluctant to act in the past, as Matthew was saying, is we are so worried about risking escalation. And I think, you know, the point's been made that actually maybe we were too anxious about risking escalations in the past, and that's what stopped us from acting.
You don't think it was donations to the Conservative Party? 1.5 million in 2019. Could that have compromised?
Was it, George? You better answer that.
Well, I think our reliance on dodgy Russian money across society has been a huge mistake. But I think it was also...
But were you influenced by donations?
No, not at all. Not at all.
But you don't think unconsciously it might have influenced executive decision-making?
Well, certainly,
the way that we
for
know
me, I'd run a million miles from a dodgy Russian with money. But I make the point that London has become far too dependent, money laundering and the kleptocracy playing. But I think to Matthew and the lady's point, I think the world is waking up a bit, and I think we've recognised that the danger of not acting is that bullies get their way. And I think, by the way, in Syria... I was one of the MPs who voted against David Cameron's suggestion that we go in and bomb Assad. I felt the mood of the country was that we didn't want to repeat Iraq, and many of you may have felt the same way. But I think, unfortunately, we did send a signal to Putin, you can get away with it. Yeah. And I think, you know, with what we've got to... I think Matthew's right, the whole of the Westminster class, we're all waking up to the fact that the world is a pretty dangerous place, and there are big, dangerous countries who will move when we're weak. So I do get that it costs money. We are training, and we're training our own pilots brilliantly, and we can train them. And we have.
Are we training enough of our own pilots? That was your point.
Well, I mean, I have RAF Marham in my patch. I don't get complaints from the RAF there. They got.
But there have been suggestions that we're not training enough pilots for the jets that we already have.
I don't think that's right. And in the end, training their pilots in Ukraine will save our pilots having to go there. I mean, it's all part of Western security. But I do get the point that the cost of this, one of the reasons we've hit so much debt. You know, the Ukraine war has cost us both materially, but also in terms of Putin's response on energy crisis. And I think just being open-eyed about what these big geodiplomatic battles cost is really important. Personally, I think it's a battle we have to win.
Inaya.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that foreign policy is always morally complicated and there are always trade-offs. And just as there's consequences to acting and intervening, there are also consequences to not doing something, as was mentioned. And as Matthew mentioned, when it came to Crimea, we were much more reluctant. And that is argued emboldened Putin to take further action. And I think I speak for most people on the panel that what has been extraordinarily remarkable over the last year is to see the bravery and courage of the Ukrainian people. And I remember this time last year when this conversation was being had, many people thought that the Ukrainian society would fall very quickly. And actually, it has been their bravery and willingness to fight for ideals that many of us take for granted, sovereignty...
But coming back to the question, Inaya, because Zelensky has made it quite clear he wants and needs jets. Well, he's absolutely clear about that. At the moment, no one is minded to send in any jets, but nothing is off the table. If NATO were to send jets, do you think that would provoke an escalation? Well,
I think that it is important in a geopolitical context where you have hostile nations willing to so flagrantly violate basic principles and international norms that we take a strong stance in showing that we will, to the very end, support Ukraine and stand side by side with them.
It's a balance of risks. The risk of escalation weighed against the risk of giving in to a bully. That's the calculation. And somebody talked about geopolitics. I just invite everyone to take a step back for a second, because I think this is worth saying. Which country is the biggest beneficiary of what is happening? China. We are in a cost of living crisis.
Do you want to explain why?
I wouldn't mind. The West is suffering with inflation, unemployment. We're squeezed in all sorts of ways. We are, in my view, rightly giving munitions to Ukraine. But if another trouble flares up in the Middle East or in the South China Sea, we're going to be vulnerable. China, by the way, is getting oil at a huge discount from Russia at the moment. There is an axis evolving China, Russia, Iran, and to a certain extent North Korea. We have to be wise to that. It's one of the reasons I think we should give wings to Ukraine. I think if this war drags on for too long, the West will be weakened while China becomes ever stronger. And our political class needs to understand the longer-term implications of what this war means.
OK. I'm going to move on. I think there's no sign, sadly, of this war ending soon. I think this is a topic we will come back to many times. Before I take another question, I just want to tell you that Question Time is in Rugby in Warwickshire next week, and the week after we're in Cardiff. So if you'd like to come to either show, go to the Question Time website. You can see the address on the screen. Follow the instructions there, either for Rugby or Cardiff, or any of our shows up until Easter, and come and be part of our audience. We'd love to see you. Right, let's take another question now from Amanda Kennedy.
Should an MP who says some people who use food banks cannot budget and is in favour of the death penalty be promoted to Deputy Conservative Party Chairman?
Right. So this is Lee Anderson. He's just been promoted this week, and he claimed last year that there wasn't a massive use for food banks in this country, and those who knew how to cook and budget should be able to make meals for 30p a day. And he also said, in a recent interview, nobody's ever committed a crime after being executed, 100% success rate, and supports the return of the death penalty. Well, this is your new Deputy Conservative Party Chairman, George. Do you agree with those sentiments?
No. No, I absolutely don't.
So should he be in the job?
And let me be clear, government collective responsibility, I know people think MPs and government's the same, but actually the government, Rishi Sunak's team of ministers, of whom I'm one, abide by a strict code of collective responsibility. And there's no doubt that what Lee Anderson said is completely in breach of those standards you'd expect for ministers. So he wouldn't be...
If he's very senior in the party...
Let me finish,
Come on, there may be a technical difference between being in the Cabinet and being Conservative Deputy Party Chairman. He's very senior, outward-facing the Conservative Party, and you think his views are completely wrong?
The point I was making is that Parliament is a place that needs to speak for all the people of this country, even voices we don't all want to hear. And Lee Anderson does speak for a lot of people in this country. It's important that people from the left and the right, people of dissonant voices and views, are heard. That doesn't mean we all have to agree with them, but it is really important in a parliament that people can speak. And the Conservative Party, like the Labour Party, is a very broad church, and there are many people in this country who are very worried. I happen deeply not to agree with him on capital punishment. I happen not to agree with him that people are abusing food banks. We're going through a terrible period where a lot of people are really struggling. But I think it is important that MPs are able to speak as they see it for their constituencies. And he's one of about 20 vice chairman, deputy chairman of the Conservative Party who are going out around the country speaking for and building our membership around the country. So he's not a minister, but I just think the Conservative Party is a broad church. Parliament should be as well. I don't think he's saying anything like the hard anti-Semitic hard left under Corbyn, who we've now got rid of, thankfully. I think it's a voice that many won't agree with, but Parliament needs to be free.
So just check, are you happy that he said it?
No, I think it's an unhelpful thing to say.
Right. OK, Inaya.
Well, I do agree that in Parliament we should have a wide range of views, and I fundamentally disagree with Lee Anderson on many of those issues that he's raised. But actually, according to the polls, there is a sizable minority of the population that share some of his views on capital punishment. I think it's illiberal. I think it's a barbaric form of punishment. But he has the right to express his views. What I worry about, though, is that this is the kind of discussion that is passing off for serious politics. You know, we have big challenges this country is facing, whether that's the cost of living crisis that was mentioned, the fact that we've had very little growth in our economy.
You might not like it now, but he is a serious politician, and he has raised this point today.
Well, I don't think...
the point has been raised today.
I don't think that this type of discussion, you know, should pass off a serious political conversation when we have huge challenges in our country. And I would really question the logic of that decision by Rishi Sunak.
OK, let's hear from our audience. Yes, the woman in the glasses.
I just find it absolutely astounding, actually, that you're sitting here and kind of even legitimising this promotion. You know, one of the overwhelming kind of sentiments that came out of the shambles that was the Liz Truss administration, one of the arguments against giving the electorate the general election that the polling was showing they were absolutely screaming out for was that actually the Tory party would have been decimated and there would have been no effective opposition. And the idea was that even the Tory backbenchers were saying that Rishi Sunak should have time to clear up the reputation of the party, pull things back together, because, you know, we do work in a two-party system. And since that time, you know, we've seen the Home Secretary peddling, you know, dangerous right-wing sort of rhetoric. We've seen Jonathan Gullis shouting abuse across the floor to, you know, vulnerable abducted children. And now, you know, with the promotion of Lee Anderson as well, and the fact that anybody can sit there and defend that and be happy to sit in another round of musical chairs in the Cabinet Office, I just think is frankly appalling.
Man there in the check shirt.
Why shouldn't we have capital punishment for the worst of the worst, child abusers, murderers and paedophiles?
OK, and that is a view, as you say, there's a sizable minority that share that view. Yes, I've heard from you, I'll come back to you in a minute. The man there in the green shirt and the glasses.
I think we're getting a bit confused in respect of the gentleman there saying that the Prime Minister and everybody in the House of Westminster or whatever is going by a code of practice. But none of it makes sense, because in the last 30 years, you've all made these promises and everything, and they've never come to fruition. A typical example is the NHS hospital, which the Conservatives built their manifesto on. They were supposed to build 40 hospitals. So far, they've built 3, and the rest of them they haven't even got planning permission for. So your code of practice doesn't work. So for you to sit there and say this, it's just farcical. When you've got a house full of the government, every day sits in government and they just talk twaddle. They never answer the basic problems.
Right.
They just, you know.
No, we hear you loud and clear. And, George, I will give you a chance to respond to talking basic twaddle. But before I do, I'm just going to get around the rest of the panel. Sarah.
Well, honestly, George, I don't think it's good enough to say that we've got to have a range of voices and reflect. The Prime Minister has appointed Lee Anderson to speak for the Conservative Party. There's an expectation that he will reflect Conservative views. Now, if you're telling me that Lee Anderson's view that people are only poor because they can't budget properly, which I think is just incredibly insulting. And what that says to me is that the Tory party would prefer to think that people are poor because it's their own fault and that therefore they don't have any responsibility to deal with it. That is what Lee Anderson is saying. That is what the Prime Minister has appointed him to say on behalf of the Conservative Party. It is not good enough to say that we need a range of voices in Parliament and that you're not responsible. I'm not saying you personally, but that the Conservative Party are not responsible for putting those opinions out there, demonising poor people and saying that, frankly, it's not the government's business to try and address the causes of poverty. It is not good enough.
Let me say, I disagree with Lee Anderson. I disagree with his politics. I didn't like what he said about capital punishment or the cost of living. But I do agree with George. I'm a journalist, and journalism suffers from having an intake that comes from a very similar social class and background, very many upper middle class. The same is true in politics. As I understand it, Lee Anderson, George, is from a background, he was a single father. He struggled with poverty.
It's minor.
Not something you could say about David Cameron, for example. We may disagree with his views on capital punishment. I guess that half the audience disagrees. As I understand it from polling, 40% of the country agrees with that opinion. Why not have that represented in Parliament? Why do we need to have that shut down? Is not Parliament about debate and discussion? I want to see people from different backgrounds, particularly different social classes. It drives me nuts when people talk about poverty without having ever experienced it. Yeah. Don't we gain knowledge and a granular understanding of what it means to be in poverty when we have suffered from it ourselves? We miss Brexit, I think, as a consequence of a homogenous political and media elite. We need to diversify so that these views are expressed. Yeah, we can argue, we can disagree, we can combat what Lee Anderson says, but to shut him down and throw him out because you disagree with that opinion, I think would be a tragedy for the vibrancy of democracy.
But I just want to... Do you think Lee Anderson is increasing people's understanding of what it's like to live in poverty when he makes remarks like that?
Well, do you know what? I'm lucky enough. I went to a state school, a not particularly well-to-do background. I'm lucky enough to be earning decent money now. I think I don't know. And I find it interesting to listen. You have surgeries, right? And you hear from people who are struggling with poverty. As I understand, what did he say? He didn't say that everybody who is going to a food bank is...
he said that people need to learn to budget.
He basically said, some people said that he didn't believe that there was such a massive use of food banks. He questioned whether nurses should need to use food banks. He said those who know how to cook and budget should be able to make meals.
Is it possible that budgeting more effectively could help in certain situations? I found that an interesting contribution. I started thinking about the way I budget. Do you think that this is a completely... such an awful point of view, it should be ruled out of court in public debate?
My question, what I'm saying is that the view of the Conservative Party? That that poverty doesn't exist as a problem as long as you can make meals for 30p. I don't think you can, incidentally, and I do budget. But
we'll tell you what, we've got a whole load of people here, so let's hear from them. So I'm trying to get around quite a few of you now. So, yes, the woman there in the... Is it dark top? I can't quite see.
Yeah. So I completely agree, and I think there is a lack of diversity.
Who do you agree with? Different views here.
Matthew. Because I think there is a lack of diversity and probably a lack of different backgrounds, and I wonder whether... if Lee Anderson followed a nurse around for a day and did their job for 12 hours, he could then get home and cook a nutritious and balanced meal, having had the time to find all the ingredients for the right prices. I think there's a lack of understanding of the context of that and not just the basics of could you do that, on paper. Of course you could. But when you've worked a long shift, no.
And the young woman at the far end.
I think the absolute fundamentals of this debate is that it comes from a place of privilege. I work for a charity and I can see every day the demographics of people who walk through our door are changing. It's everyday working people that are suffering. It's not this conception of people being on the poverty line. It's people working in schools, it's people working in hospitals, and it's people, everyday people who are needing help and cannot pay or afford to pay for food for their children. So I think really it's just coming from a complete place of privilege and burying their heads in the sand and thinking it's not an us problem. But
I mean, Lee Anderson would argue that he hasn't come from a background of privilege, but I hear what you're saying. Woman there in the pink top.
I don't think he did come from privilege. I think nurses are earning the average wage, and what he said was some people.
Yes.
So I don't think you should damn people because they're Conservative, so obviously they're privileged. This is a nonsense. I think he had absolutely every right to say it, and I'm pleased he did. And I think that a lot of people will agree...
And on the death penalty, can I ask, do you support that, as his views on that as well?
Absolutely. If something happened to a member of my family and they were destroyed or killed, I wouldn't want to see my tax money going on keeping them alive in a prison when I really feel that perhaps it's a life for a life and they shouldn't be there.
OK. Man there in the stripy T-shirt. Oh, in the blue jumper you've got there, I think.
Hello. I don't think Lee Anderson has been in the kitchen very often because to try and get a meal for 30 pence for your family shouldn't be an MP, as far as I'm concerned.
OK. And the guy in the stripy T-shirt.
So I'm a lifelong Conservative voter and member, and I never thought I'd be saying this, but I've actually left the Conservative Party. I think they just have completely lost touch with normal people like myself, and I actually think they would benefit from some time in opposition.
All right. So, Lisa, I've waited a while to get to you just because I wanted to hear a quite wide range of views. So, should an MP, Lee Anderson, who says some people use food banks, can't budget and is in favour of the death penalty, should he be promoted to Deputy Conservative Party Chairman?
Well, first of all, can I just challenge this idea that because Lee Anderson comes from a mining background and a working class background, that people who are working class miners hold these views across the board? I find it really offensive. As somebody who represents a working class mining constituency, I can tell you that my constituents are volunteering in those food banks, not insulting the people who use them. Secondly, I would just say to George that I think this is a real problem, and I think you know it's a real problem. It's not that Lee Anderson isn't free to express his views as a member of Parliament in Parliament. Of course he is. He's elected by the people of Ashfield. They elected him, I presume, knowing what his views were, and he's perfectly entitled to express them. The problem is when you've got a Prime Minister who decides that this is the person that he wants to be the face of the Conservative Party, knowing what those views were. The difference between your party and mine is that when we had the scourge of anti-Semitism in our party, we kicked them out. You're promoting people. And not only Lee Anderson, but we've got a Prime Minister now whose judgment really has to be called into question. Not only has he promoted this man, despite disagreeing vehemently with his views on a whole range of issues, he reappointed a Home Secretary who'd broken the ministerial code and been sacked for it after just 6 days, and he appointed a Deputy Prime Minister without investigating allegations that were swirling around serious incidents of bullying and harassment in his own office. Where is the judgment and where is the leadership?
OK, I'm going to come back to you. I'll take a couple of points. Man here. Yes.
Although I don't hold the same views as this guy, respectfully, Lisa, we pay you to have debates and we don't pay you to be offended. Yep. So I think
I'm not
you
offended,
leave...
I just don't...
You
So
said you were offended. You
Party.
said it. You turned around and you said, I'm offended by what he said. We don't pay you to be offended. We pay you to have arguments. Like, we pay you to have arguments with other politicians and come to a resolution.
In fact, I've had many...
Let him finish and then you can answer. Yes, sorry, go on.
Like, you're likely going to be the next party in power, and I'm really interested to hear from you and hear your views and what your views are as a party, because I'll be realistic. Like the other chap, I've previously voted Conservative and I think they've lost it. I'm interested in hearing your point of view. I'm not interested in you being offended. If you want to make progress with these people and their views, you've got to talk it out with them. You can't get rid of them. You can't silence, like, people talk about silent majority, you can't silence people like that. Anyway, sorry.
Sorry, I didn't for one moment suggest that we wouldn't have the debate. In fact, I was very explicit that Lee Anderson is elected by the people of Ashfield, who presumably knew the views that he held when they elected him. He's perfectly entitled to come to Parliament to express those views, and I have had many a robust debate with Lee Anderson in Parliament, in public and in private about those issues, and I will continue to do so because I think that that is important for a healthy democracy. But what I think is unacceptable is to have a Prime Minister who says that these views are abhorrent and then promotes this man to be the face of the Conservative Party and then refuses to accept any responsibility for it. I agree, actually, with this point about the simplification and the dumbing down of the debate that we're seeing as a result. If you take the death penalty, for example, we shouldn't be debating the return of the death penalty. I firmly believe it's barbaric, and I'll have that argument with anyone who cares to have it. What we should be debating is why we've got 3 murders or serious sexual crimes a week being committed by people who are released on probation. We should be debating how to fix our broken criminal justice system, not these simplistic solutions.
George, obviously I'm going to come back to you. I'm not sure how representative you are of people in the audience, but you've just had 2 people now say, I voted Conservative, I'm not going to be voting anymore, to paraphrase, because I think you've lost it.
Yeah.
What do you say to them?
I've got to say to them is we have a mountain to climb. The Prime Minister's made that clear. We understand that. Well, some think it's funny. It's great. I mean, I'm just being honest. I'm not trying to whitewash it. We have a mountain to climb, and we're setting off to climb it. And I, for one, am working my socks off. We've got 2 years, and I think the public want to see us debate properly the big issues of the day, grip the big issues. I think the Prime Minister, in his 5-point plan, set out. Some may find it boring, but it's pretty important that we get on top of inflation, that we reduce debt, that we drive growth up, that we get invest the money we are in the NHS backlogs, and we get on top of the small boats. And I happen to think, just on the judgment issue about the Prime Minister, that for me, when he arrived in number 10, I breathed a huge sigh of relief. Here is a man with proper standards, proper integrity, proper discipline, and he fired Nadeem Zahawi as soon as due process had been gone through properly. And
I mean, the counter of that is you're suggesting the people that came before didn't have any of those things.
Well, I don't think they had him in the level that Rishi Sunak's had them. No. And just on the point, if I may, just to deal with...
Not a high bar.
While we're talking about crime, I do think Sadiq Khan in London's got something to answer on knife crime. It is completely out of control, and the Labour Party in London aren't discussing it. But on this point, Lee Anderson, look, if I may, on food poverty...
Reasonably briefly.
Food poverty, if we get to a point where... And I don't agree with what he said and the way he said it, but to just suggest that there's a food budgeting problem If that's a crime, we're in a terrible place if that becomes a thought crime. The truth is, in my food banks in Norfolk, we do have a really deep problem with a whole generation who haven't been brought up cooking food. We've had very cheap delivery food. We've got heating costs that are enormous. So there's a whole debate about food nutrition standards, which is one that we have to have. But my big point is this, to the point here from this gentleman, if you get to a point where inconvenient, provocative, inflammatory views can't be aired in Parliament.
He's representing your
Let me
party.
just finish for a minute.
You just called it inflammatory and provocative.
There's only one thing I fear more than a Parliament with somebody like Lee Anderson in it. It's a Parliament where you're not allowed to say what the people who put you there want you to say. And that is why the people of Ukraine are fighting. They want freedom, liberty, and the...
So hang on, George. Are you... Sorry, hang on a minute. Are you comparing Lee Anderson to the fight in Ukraine?
No. But
which is where hundreds of thousands are dying.
No, what I'm saying is the liberties and the freedoms that we take for granted in this country are freedoms that people around the world, particularly in Ukraine, yearn for. And they yearn to be able to have the debate. They yearn to have somebody in Parliament
Has anyone
with
here said that Lee Anderson shouldn't be an MP? I don't think they have.
Well, they're getting...
George... Hang on. OK, Matthew, last word, and then I'm going to move on.
I don't think there's much Liberal
all
Democrat
I was going to say is,
about that.
Lisa mentioned Dominic Raab. I don't know what the audience view is on this. I'm not that keen on Dominic Raab. I disagreed with his views on Brexit. But imagine if you were accused of bullying and you didn't believe that you were a bully. Would you not want due process?
Yeah.
Would you not want to give your side of the story?
And of course, Dominic Raab has denied all.
He's denied it. And by the way, the number of people who have called for him to be sacked on the basis of allegations that have not been substantiated through a proper process. I remember as a sports journalist, Sam Allardyce was accused of agreeing to give speeches in the Middle East and give undercover reporters a way to break the rules. By 5 o'clock on that day, he was sacked. I think this is a disgrace. When we found out what had actually happened, it turned out that he hadn't agreed to give these speeches. It turned out that he hadn't agreed to break the rules. This was something that was completely antithetical to natural justice. I don't like Richie Sunak that much, but he's absolutely right to take a step back and allow due process to take its course so we can establish the facts.
We're getting a bit far away from Lee Anderson, but right. OK.
You were talking about Dominic Raab being sacked.
Dominic Raab needs to be sacked. I said he didn't even ask the question when these rumours were put in.
We're getting quite a way away from Lee Anderson. So I'm going to stop it there for the moment. Now, a lot of you have asked this next question, and I'm intrigued to know how many of you will know about it and how many of you will be slightly bamboozled by it. So let's hear from Steve Cuthbertson.
Will the recent rapid rise of ChatGPT, a computer that understands language, solve the worldwide shortage of workers or create mass unemployment?
Right, so who here knows what ChatGPT is? OK, so pretty much most of you, not entirely all of you. So just for those few of you in the audience and those of you at home, ChatGPT, which incidentally I found out today stands for Chat Generative Pre-trained Transformer. So it's an artificial intelligence chatbot, and the difference with it is it can generate human-like text for tasks like answering questions, writing essays, writing articles, even writing poems, writing music. It's a new form of artificial intelligence that has, worried some people, like teachers, for example. What's it about Steve Believe? It's good to you have a job, Matthew. I thought I'd come to you first. Because what it can do is it can generate articles and essays, as I say. So will it solve the worldwide shortage of workers or create mass unemployment?
Can you explain to us what it is as politicians on the panel?
It's a chatbot, and it is I bumped into... Am I allowed to mention that I was on the Piers Morgan show 2 nights ago on
well, I think you just have.
On Talk TV, and ChatGPT was asked to automatically generate a tweet in the style of Piers Morgan, and it came up with something like, "You damn snowflakes, we need to sort out this," and woke ideology and so on. So I mean, it's
well, actually, on that, because what you can do with this thing, ChatGPT, is you can ask it to write something in the style of.
Yeah.
So I asked it to write my Question Time intro in the style of Shakespeare. So I thought I'd just share it with you. So if I were to open the programme, I'd say, "Good morrow." We have George Freeman, a scholar of great renown. We also have Lisa Nandy, a statesman of the highest order. And before us, a throng of eager audience members who bring forth their questions and concerns. Pray, what questions have ye for our esteemed panel this day? Speak forth, good citizens. Let us hear thy thoughts. So anyway, that's the kind of thing it can do. And of course, other chatbots are available, it has to be said. So is it, but seriously, is this the portend of things to come in terms of wiping out an awful lot of jobs for a lot of people?
It is an example of the progress of artificial intelligence, which trades on information. The two great dystopias of the 20th century were written by two British authors, George Orwell and Aldous Huxley. Orwell was worried about censorship. You might remember Big Brother in 1984 and the central state policing the amount of information the public could get a hold of. This morphed, I think, into an apparition that has hung over Western societies ever since. And I think we are rightly concerned about the big tech companies acting as gamekeepers to the public square and cancel culture and other things of this kind. On balance, though, I think Huxley's vision was more apposite. He worried not that there would be censorship of information, but we would drown in information. Think of the number of gigabytes that are tweeted out each day on Substacks, blogs, newspaper websites, social media feeds, Twitter. How are we supposed to discern truth amid all of that noise? And I think we're being congenitally distracted as a society onto trivialities. I think this will be exacerbated by the metaverse, where we'll be pulled into the wormhole of virtual reality. I don't think artificial intelligence is an answer to our problems. I think it could do good things like diagnose cancers from radiograms, but I think there is a massive risk to our world. And I do worry that our political class is capable of harnessing and controlling a technology I'm not sure they truly understand.
Okay. Inaya?
Well, I think when the social media emerged, there was lots of debate about the possibilities. On the one hand, people thought it was going to bring us all together and this was going to be the future. On the other hand, people were worried that this was going to cause a whole new set of problems, and that is what we have seen, that with social media as well, it can contribute to political polarisation. So ultimately, I agree with Matthew that when it comes to these new technologies that are emerging, artificial intelligence, but also biotechnology, we should get on the front foot as a society in terms of what kind of society we want to create and how we want to utilise these technologies to ensure that they're doing good for humanity and doing good for citizens. One of the interesting things about this particular artificial intelligence, it is subject to human fallibility as well in terms of political bias that we've seen that has emerged, and, for example, the possibility for people to not be able to have certain jobs. So there are big questions that these technologies arise, and I think it's really important that politicians take seriously the future of technology to make sure that the morality and ethics around it are actually in favour of humanity.
Yes, the man there in the dark jacket.
Yeah, I completely agree with Matthew about artificial intelligence, generally speaking. I mean, I'm not sure what value it's going to add. It's great for gaming, but what value will it add other than cybercrime for mimicking people and copying people? There's an inherent risk of exacerbating that problem. We're talking about metaverse as the replacement for teams within in private sector. I don't really want to fist bump somebody virtually, thanks. I still want to sit at their desk and talk to them. I think it's fantastic we can achieve these things, and I don't want to hold back on invention, but just rein it in terms of once we've proven it, isn't that's the fun gone sometimes?
Man here in the front.
Was it George, our new minister, what give you the technology on this new GP, whatever it is?
Chat GPT.
Yeah. And the other thing is, do you think it'll give us the lottery numbers for Friday night's lottery?
Now that's kind of artificial intelligence we could all support. Yes, absolutely. And the man there in the check shirt and the blue tie.
So PwC reported on this very issue about job losses that may occur with artificial intelligence, and they have reported that by mid-2025 or so, 3% of jobs will be put at risk. By mid-2030, 30% of jobs will be put at risk. And in those with the lowest education, about 44% of jobs will be put at risk. So it's going to be a big problem that will probably rise in the future and affect those who are on the lower rungs of education.
But also with the technology that is not necessarily on the lower rungs of education.
Correct.
Because of its ability to generate so much text. So you were sort of laughing, Lisa, saying, oh, can they tell us, the politicians, about you? Him, he's saying you need to be on the front foot, you need to understand this stuff.
Yeah, totally. And the point that Inaya made about being able for politicians to be able to really understand it and get to grips with it. We're living through a tech revolution and we're all playing catch-up, and I think that it's absolutely right to challenge us about that. But, you know, a few years ago I was sitting with the NSPCC. They run Childline, fantastic resource for children and young people that started when I was a child. And I was amazed by the views of young people about emerging technology. They saw this as a lifeline. It was gold dust, because when I was a kid, if you wanted to go and report abuse in the home, you had to go and find a phone box, find some money, ring them up. It was really hard. Now they've got young people who are able to WhatsApp them, who are able to put messages on Instagram and other forms of social media and get the help that they need fast. And often they can do it in a way that's anonymous, which means that they're far less frightened to do it. And these young people said to me, please, the debate about technology is so negative in politics, and it's right to be alive to the risks that it can pose. The case of children being caused online harm is certainly one that's very live in our minds at the moment as we debate this in Parliament. But we've got to start thinking about how in every technological revolution and every era of history in which we live through one, and this is one, this has been the debate that we've had. The rise of the printing press caused all sorts, it caused hundreds of years of upheaval, huge changes to society. And the key was to make sure that we got on the front foot and harnessed that technology so that it could be used for the common good. That's this generation's challenge as well. And I like to think that by having these sorts of debates, by you know, some of the points that Matthew was making about the predictions about the future and thinking more about where we're going in the future, that perhaps this time we might be able to crack it much more quickly.
Well, so, George, this must be right up your alley in your new job, because you are, I mean, only as of 2 days, in this marvellous new Department of Science, Technology and Innovation. So I imagine you're all over ChatGPT. So is it going to solve the worldwide shortage of workers or create mass unemployment?
Well, I'm all over AI. In fact, I used to run a very basic... I set up an AI company years ago doing drug discovery, looking in the pharmacopoeia of failed medicines.
So what's the answer to this question?
The answer to this question is, I'm not worried, and I don't think we need to worry about the economic impact. I think Lisa is right, that we're in an industrial technological revolution and the jobs will change. And AI has huge positive impacts as well in healthcare, in drug discovery, in climate change. AI is fundamental to spotting patterns of weather and in Antarctica, and in crime, spotting fraud. There are real issues about the power shift, to Matthew's point. And so making sure that the big tech platforms can't, through data mining, text mining, take Matthew's journalism, reassemble it, rehash it in a virtual Matthew and sell it around the world without him getting any compensation. So there's some real issues about fairness.
And do you think, because what we've heard from our audience is that politicians need to be leading the way with this process.
I've got good news on this one. Yeah, we're on it in both ways. In investment, last year we raised 40 billion into deep tech and AI in London. We are the world's #1 AI economy with huge opportunities. And in terms of the technology, quantum computing and the deep tech, that's literally partly why we set up this department. But I think the real issue is regulation. And interestingly, there's an opportunity for us here. The EU has been regulating on the technology, bad technology, good technology. We're going to regulate on the application of it. Using AI to steal his content is bad. Using AI to find drugs is good. The real issue, I think, is about humanity and the lived experience. And the thing I'm more worried about than the economic impact is a whole generation growing up not knowing the difference between a real conversation, between the human contact, which is core to our humanity, and a metaverse. And I think making sure our children have a real and lived experience, play outside and breathe and have that as well as a digital is more worrying to me than the economic impact.
Great point. Great point.
I want to try and get one more question in, so if you reasonably briefly, if you would, Sarah.
Oh, just really quickly. Funnily enough, George and I were actually in a debate on this in Westminster just a couple of weeks ago about the issues of the creative sector and their original creations and them needing to retain the copyright when it's used by AI. And it's precisely that point of we still need to retain that original human source for so much of our artwork and our creativity. We don't just want it to be scraped and then endlessly recycled and fed back to us in pixels and stored on servers. And I think that's the challenge. And I think the big challenge for policymakers is we can't yet imagine what AI is going to be used for. And we've just got to try and keep ahead or, you know, be responsive. But it's a really, really exciting time. I think AI is kind of coming out of the tech laboratories and it's meeting real life, and all sorts of people are starting to think, gosh, what could we use this for? And I think it's a really, really exciting time.
Right, let's fit in this last question from, it's an important one, from Paul Seeger.
How do institutions like police and possibly fire service rebuild their reputation and trust after recent high-profile rape and murder cases and accident scene photos?
Right, so, Paul, I think most people will be familiar with the allegations that have been made against not just the Metropolitan Police, but a number of other police services as well. Perhaps not quite so familiar with allegations against the fire service that functions here in Swindon. That's Dorset and Wiltshire Fire Service, who it's alleged photographed women who had died in car accidents and shared those photographs on WhatsApp groups. Lisa, how do they rebuild their reputation and trust?
Well, I think, first of all, there has to be a clarity about how completely unacceptable this is. From most of the political parties across the board, there has been wholehearted condemnation of some of the recent cases that we've seen. But that's not always been the case.
It seems so obvious how unacceptable it is, and yet these things keep happening.
Well, no, except that we have had a few cases of politicians in parts of the country suggesting that perhaps women are responsible for the attacks against them, and trying to downplay the impact of what has happened. I don't think that's acceptable. I think we have to be absolutely clear that it's unacceptable, and we won't rest until we've dealt with it, because it lets down the public, it lets down women, it erodes trust. How can you trust that the person that you're going to in a difficult situation is going to be able to act on your behalf? And it also lets down other very good police and firefighters who are doing a very, very good, important job in very difficult circumstances. I think the one thing, you know, training, guidance, action against those officers responsible, but I also think leadership matters, because you have to create a culture in which these things are completely unacceptable. And that's why I would say that Sadiq Khan was absolutely right to take action against Cressida Dick, who was presiding over a failing force. I think that's the sort of clarity and leadership that we need to see in these cases.
We haven't got long, and this is a hugely important subject, so you have to be reasonably brief, because I do want to try and bring the audience in. Inaya.
I mean, everyone is shocked and appalled about the horrific cases that we've seen. And I think there are bad people in the world that see an institution like the police, because of the position and authority that it has, and uses that position and uses the position to exploit and harm people. And I think everybody thinks that that is unacceptable. And I think if you speak to most police officers, they're just as appalled and sickened.
How do they rebuild trust in their reputation?
Well, I think that what has been quite interesting and important about some of these cases is the fact that there seem to have been some signs, and that actually people had reported some issues, and that many of those people were not removed or spotted quickly enough. And so I think that more investigation needs to be found out. That are some police forces closing ranks when these things emerge? Is there something that we need to look at in terms of recruitment and even psychological testing to be able to spot these kinds of people? Of course, we should find out and investigate when these things happen. But I think even though it has become a cliche, it is important to reiterate that police do an incredibly dangerous job, risk their life, and the overwhelming majority are just as appalled by these horrific instances.
Matthew.
I think there is clearly a cultural problem in certain parts of the police force. How did David Carrick operate in plain sight for so long? That troubles me deeply. But can I say something slightly unfashionable? I live on in Richmond, in Sarah's constituency, I live on a very small road. It's only about 80 yards long. And about a month and a half ago, somebody was stabbed to death on our road. And we went outside that morning and we knew nothing of what had unfolded the night before. And my son and daughter, Teddy and Evie, they're 9 and 10, they looked across and there were pools of blood and it was cordoned off and there were police all over the place. And they were understandably frightened. This knife crime is sending chills down the spine of the youth in our big cities. And one of the police officers who was guarding the site beckoned my son and daughter over and he said, "You know what? We're going to find the perpetrator of this crime and we're here to protect you. And they looked up and it was just a wonderful thing to witness. And then later, me and Ted went to watch a rugby game. We came back and we had a longer conversation. And I'd watch them during the day. They were assiduous. They worked so hard to reassure their neighbourhood. And I looked at the Twitter feed of the Met Police, the crimes they're solving. Let's not tarnish all police officers, many of whom are as appalled as we are by the misogyny in their midst.
You've at the and that, of course, is true. At the same time, you had the head of a number of independent girls' schools saying, I can no longer recommend to my girl students that they approach a police officer when they're alone. Sarah?
Well, it's great to hear that tribute to my local police force, who do work incredibly hard and, you know, do great work in our community. But it's been
when you hear a head teacher saying things like that, that's shocking.
Exactly. It's been very difficult because, obviously, as a London MP and hearing these awful things that have been coming out of the Metropolitan Police, it doesn't make us feel safe. It doesn't make women and girls feel safe. It's a real problem.
So how do they rebuild the reputation? That's the question.
Yes, it's been great to hear from the new Met Commissioner, Mark Rowley, about, you know, he took it on board straight away, the recommendations in Dame Casey's report about, you know, how that's going, you know, how it needs to be tackled. It is around recruitment, it's about disciplinary. But I think, above all, there needs to be the understanding that police officers hold a lot of power. And if you give people power, that can be abused. So there needs to be the proper scrutiny, the proper vigilance, the proper supervision, and that just needs to be there as part of the culture and the understanding. If you step out of line, that, you know, there will be consequences.
George, the question is, how can they rebuild trust and the reputation? Have you got anything to add to what's already been said?
Yes. Condemnation is crucial, but it then must lead not into self-righteous kind of, well, we've condemned it and now we can move on. Yeah. It's the next bit that's key. Honesty about the problem, and real leaders shine a light on the failings of their institutions with the courage to tackle them. Training and best practice. And dare I say it, data. I have a family member who works for HMIC, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary. The data tells you the story. Great hospitals, great police forces report better, they do better. So dare I say it, there's a very strong data bit here. But I think the real key is culture. And I think the question we should all be asking is, where do monsters like David Carrick get these ideas from? Where does it come from? And I think it does come back partly to the online harms bill. We've got to make sure that we're not allowing a generation to grow up indulging, I mean, weird, barbaric fantasies in something.
But hang on, he was no spring chicken, David.
No,
this is well before social media. He was commissioning.
No, I understand, but I think there is a problem that a lot of the cultural norms online fuel behaviours in people like Carrick and others, and we've got to tackle it, which is why we're doing the online harms. But in the end, it's about leadership of institutions.
I'm going to try and get round. I've got about a minute left. Yes, the young woman there.
I find myself agreeing with what you've just said there around shining a light on it. I think it's, of course, we don't want to hear it, but I think the more that we bring it to attention that it's happening, the more that we can start to do something about it. And look, if the only way to get around it is by naming and shaming people, hopefully it's a positive impact and they will just think about it twice before they do it in the future.
OK. The man in the glasses there in the check shirt. Yes?
I believe the police will restore public trust when they drop the wokery. A lady was arrested the other day for praying outside an abortion clinic. And he asked her, was she saying anything? She said, no. What were you doing? She said, I was praying. And the thought police, you know, they need to get rid of the wokery. And that they need to get back to normal policing, you know. And I think they've lost the plot. That's the problem.
OK.
Is that Nigel Thompson?
It is.
Oh, my goodness.
OK. We're out of time.
First vicar at my church.
Oh, my goodness. Right, OK. We are out of time on that note. OK. Who knew? Matthew. My goodness. Right, our hour is up.
Wow.
Thank you. You can chat afterwards. You can have a cup of tea. Isn't that what you do with the vicar? Yeah, our hour is up. Thank you very much indeed to the panel, to our audience here in Swindon. Great to see you. And, of course, thank you to you at home watching. From Question Time. Bye-bye.